Hello, everyone. My name is Christine Chen, Executive Director and founder for Asian and Pacific Islander American Vote. Thank you for joining us today as we release some new findings of the 2024 People of Color Young Voter Survey. It is so exciting for APIAVote to be collaborating with PODER Latinx and the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation as we go ahead and really focus on additional insights on what the people of color, young voters, are looking at as we head into the last 2 weeks of this election cycle. It's also really exciting to see that all three of our organizations and a number of others are really focusing on people of color, young voters, to increase their voter registration and civic participation. So without further ado, I am going to go hand it over to Guy Molyneux, who is our partner at Hart Research Associates.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you to all three groups for including us in this important project. If we can go to the next slide, I want to just run through what we have done. We've conducted a survey of 800 registered voters across eight of the battleground states. And in each case, we are limiting the sample to voters of color aged 18 to 44, so encompassing both Gen Z voters rather, and millennials. The interviews were conducted from the 11th to the 15th of the month. And you can see the exact breakdown of the number of interviews that we had with young Black voters, young Latinx voters, and young AAPI voters in these battleground states. We did include young Native American voters as part of the overall sample. However, unlike the other three groups, that sample is too small for us to break out and report separate results for young Native Americans. So if we go on to the next slide, we can get started. So our focus here in the survey was to understand the issues that mattered and are mattering to young voters of color as they make their voting decisions this year, and then to go deeper to understand their views on some of those key issues and how it is influencing their vote. Like voters across the board, the economy was the issue that young voters of color said was most important to them. But then there are a number of other issues that are also quite consequential, including healthcare and abortion rights, racial equality, immigration, and climate change, all in the top tier of issues for roughly a quarter of young voters of color or more. Interestingly to me was that two issues that are perhaps the ones most often talked about in the media as issues important to young people today, college affordability and the war in Gaza, were actually at the bottom of the priority list, which isn't to say that young voters of color don't care about those issues, but they are less important than climate, the fight against racism, reproductive rights, and other issues. If we go to the next slide, we've asked young voters of color to tell us which of the presidential candidates they have more confidence in to handle many of these same issues. And they could choose that they had more confidence in Vice President Harris, more confidence in Mr. Trump, or they could also say that they had equal confidence in both. You can see that they express more confidence in Kamala Harris on every issue that we asked about, although the margin by which she has an advantage does vary considerably from issue to issue. You can see that she is the overwhelming choice when it comes to addressing abortion, dealing with racism and discrimination, healthcare, and climate change, margins of more than 50 points on all of those issues. And interestingly, when you look at the voters who say a particular issue will really be a top consideration in their own voting decisions this year, her margin is still larger on the issue of abortion. The people who say that will be an important issue to them prefer her by a 74-point margin. The same is true on dealing with racism and discrimination. The voters who care about that prefer her by a 67-point margin. And climate change voters prefer Kamala Harris by a 62-point margin. So those issues in particular seem likely to move young voters into the camp of supporting Kamala Harris. Moving on to the next slide. As a result of this preference and trust in Kamala Harris on so many different issues, young voters of color in these battleground states are currently saying they're inclined to vote for her over Donald Trump by a very large 50-point margin, 73% to 23%. You can see that margin, the advantage that the vice president has is particularly large among young Black voters, but is also, very substantial among young AAPI and young Latinx voters. We also asked voters who are supporting either Harris or Trump if they might still change their mind. And interestingly, the voters supporting Harris were more likely to say, I've made up my mind, I'm rock solid, as opposed to the Trump voters who are a bit more likely to say they still might change their mind. Let's go a little deeper into some of these specific issues, starting with the issue of abortion. We asked voters, this is a standard polling question in lots of surveys, whether people feel that abortion should be legal or illegal, and we allow them to say in all or most cases, whichever side they're on. And these young voters of color believe by a very large margin that abortion should be mostly or always legal. 69% feel that way. Just 28% feel that they should largely be illegal. And while there are some small differences between Black, Latinx, and AAPI voters, the large majority, 2/3 or more in each of the three groups, prefers that abortion be legal. We also asked in a separate question not shown here whether they believe that the Supreme Court was right to end the constitutional right to abortion. And by a 22-point margin, they disapproved of that decision to overturn Roe versus Wade and end the legal right to abortion. We also find, if we move on to the next slide, that young voters of color are quite concerned about the impact of that Supreme Court decision and resulting laws in states to limit access to abortion. We asked this question, whether they believe that these changes are making them more concerned about it becoming too difficult for people to obtain an abortion, or are they more concerned that states are making it too easy for people to get an abortion? So how do they feel about the way states are acting and legislating in this new legal environment created by the Supreme Court? And you can see by a pretty lopsided margin, 64 to 29% overall, they're more worried that states are going to go too far in the direction of making it difficult for women to access abortions. And indeed, in another question, 40% of the young voters of color said that where they live, they believe it would be difficult for someone to obtain an abortion if they wanted to obtain one today. We also asked some questions on the issue of racial discrimination and racism. Young voters of color tell us in large numbers that they still experience racial discrimination in their life. Three-fourths of them say that, including about 1 in 5 who say that that's a regular experience for them today. So Understandably, this raises the importance of that issue, which is why you saw it ranked so high on the list of their issue priorities earlier. And we also asked if this would be important in their judgment for a presidential candidate. If we go to the next slide, and you can see that almost 2/3, 64%, said it would be very important to them to elect someone to the presidency who will work to reduce racial inequality in our society. 84%, almost all of them, said that that would be important to them in choosing a presidential candidate this year. And it was particularly important to young Black voters, with 72% saying that that would be extremely important to them. A third issue we examined in depth is climate change. We asked how they felt about current efforts by the federal government to address climate change. 61% said the government is not doing enough to deal with this challenge facing our country and facing the world. At the other end of the spectrum, only 9% felt the climate was an issue that the government didn't really need to be involved in. So very little support for the idea that climate change isn't a real problem, or at least isn't one that the government needs to address, and a strong sense that more needs to be done. And that's true across all three of these populations. We then asked, what do you think should be done about climate change? And here, young voters of color chose a sort of middle path. 20% wanted to try to end the use of fossil fuels fairly soon, the next few years. Even fewer, just 10%, wanted to just keep on going using fossil fuels the way we did today. The majority, 55%, want to see a gradual transition away from fossil fuels to clean energy sources. So not immediately, but that's clearly the path they want us to be on over the next few years. We also took a look at immigration policy and whether they wanted to support an approach that focused on punitive measures like a border wall and sort of large-scale deportation of immigrants. Just a third of young voters of color favored that approach. Nearly twice as many, 60%, said they wanted an approach that strengthened security at the border, but also provided a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. So a large majority in all three groups wanting a kind of balanced approach of a secure border, but also a path to citizenship for those who are here on an undocumented basis. And the final issue we looked at is something that pollsters don't look at nearly as often as those other four issues, which is the issue of the TikTok social media platform. We asked, first, do you favor or oppose a US government ban on TikTok? Young voters of color opposed that idea of banning TikTok by a 19-point margin, 53% to 34%. But interestingly, we also asked voters separately whether they were regular users of TikTok, and a remarkable 47% said that they use TikTok daily. Those voters are strongly opposed to a ban. 70% of those voters say they oppose a ban. And if we go to the next and final slide, we asked them if they want the next president to allow the platform to shut down, as would be required under current federal law if it is not sold, or do they want the next president to try to reach a compromise solution that would allow TikTok to keep operating in this country? You can see that 2/3 of young voters of color would prefer that the next president try to find that kind of compromise that would allow TikTok to maintain operations. Among those daily TikTok users, 80% feel that way. So if either former President Trump or Vice President Harris can get out front on being the compromise candidate on the critical TikTok issue, it looks like they could have some real appeal to young voters of color in the battleground states. And with that, let me turn it back to Christine. Thank you.
Actually, I'm going to turn it over to Yadira.
Thank you, Christine. Excited to be here with our partners and sharing this important information with you all. Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is staying strong and energized as we approach the final 2 weeks before the election. Poder Latinx is currently operating in 7 states with nearly 200 organizers on the ground, and we are focused, our main focus is new voters. That includes young and newly naturalized voters. And what we're hearing at the doors reflects much of the data in this recent survey that Guy just reported. So if we can go to the next slide, just want to go over some of the top findings for Latinx voters. Our findings show that young Latinx voters in key battleground states continue to favor Kamala Harris over Donald Trump with a strong 61 to 34% margin. This aligns with the national surveys showing Harris support among Latinx voters between 61 and 66, according to the Pew Research Center. And there's a buzz in our community about Harris, like that we are seeing ourselves potentially becoming the first woman president, especially after following Mexico's historic election for the first female president. We've seen a surge in Latina voters registering, and I believe Harris' support is being undercounted, actually, especially among young Latinas who are showing real enthusiasm in key states. And on the key issues for Latinx voters, when it comes to priorities, young Latinx voters, clearly the economy is a top issue, 81%. We're seeing that at the doors, and particularly when it comes to housing. Housing continues to be a top issue that is we're hearing a lot at the doors. Healthcare, when we think of healthcare, um, other issues like abortion and democracy are also top at the forefront of their minds. But healthcare in particularly is important, especially connecting it with our cultural background, our responsibility to take care of elders. Harris recently, VP Harris recently expanded long-term care, has that the expansion of care, and when it comes to long-term care, has deeply resonated with our community, where we often see as caregiving for elderly relatives not something that a lot of low-income communities of color have access and the privilege to say goodbye to their loved ones. So that in particularly is resonating very high among our community. The support for abortion rights, more than 2/3, 67%, of young Latinx voters support the legality of abortion in all or most cases. This is significantly higher than 59% among Latinx voters overall. And we've seen this be a trend even dating back to 2022, where we saw even the most conservative Latinx voters began opposing abortion bans and restriction to personal liberties. So we're continuing to see that trend again in 2024 at a much higher rate. Race and inequality, while some argue that Latinx voters are motivated by race, our survey tells a different story. A large majority, 73% of young Latinx voters still experience racism, and 80% want a president who will actively work to reduce racial inequality. And just to close, I would say, want to highlight the Latinx electorate is a young electorate. We're 36.2 million eligible voters. Well, only 33% of Latinx eligible voters are ages over 50, in comparison with 48% of all US eligible voters. We are a young electorate. If young Latinx voters turn out in record numbers, it can transform the Latinx electorate, and it can make a real difference in key battleground states. There's a lot at stake in this election, especially for the youth. So we need to vote, and we need to vote early. And I'm going to make a plug. If you need a poll to find your polling location, please visit poderlatinx.org/vote and cast your ballot early. Together, let's make history, and let's definitely continue empowering our community to participate in our democracy. And Christine, I'll turn it back over to you. Actually, I will turn it over to Sean, colleague here.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. Similar to the information that my colleague just left, that just mentioned, the Black Youth Vote is saying some of the same thing. While our organization, the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation, is nonpartisan, we are operating in 11 states right now, including three of the states that were mentioned in this poll. We literally just left Pittsburgh and Philadelphia over the last week and a half, as well as Michigan and Detroit, Pontiac, Kalamazoo, and Benton Harbor in the last 4 to 5 days. We're hearing some of the same things, that the support for the Democratic side of the ticket is very high compared to the Republican side of the ticket. Black voters are engaged, they're excited, and they're actually really going out here and trying to spread the word to get more and more people to turn out. I'm literally on a bus tour right now in Toledo, Ohio, where we're getting ready to engage with voters as well to do the exact same thing, and continue to listen to the concerns of everybody, especially the Black youth vote, which is very important for us. At the coalition, we run our Black Youth Vote program, and we have coordinators in all of these states. And the results of this poll just allows us to continuously reinforce the messaging and the issues and positions that we're hearing from not just people who are doing polls and surveys, but the people who are actually on the ground. What I will say is, I think the results are very clear. 83% of young Black voters in battleground states are supporting the Democratic nominee. Like I said, we're hearing that over and over again as we are starting to engage with people, as we listen to them and understand their issues. The economy is number one. And I think that that is across the board for Black voters, period. But very much so in the youth space, the economy seems to be very much so the dominant conversation, followed by healthcare, which includes abortion rights as well. And then lastly, in that process is immigration. I think as Black youth, they understand the culture and the history of our ethnicity, and as a result, immigration does continue to play a big part in what they feel and who they feel can actually best represent them when it comes to that. What we're finding is that Black youth are not anti-immigration. They are more for regulated immigration, to where we understand that there's a process for citizenship, and for people to come into the country and contribute, just like every other American citizen. What we're also hearing, surprisingly, is that gun rights are also an issue for Black youth. But at the same time, again, regulations and things like that are very important to that system, and putting these policies in place. And based on that, they're feeling like the Democratic side of the ticket will be the most effective when it comes to leading the White House, leading our government, leading our country, and making us and putting in policies in place that actually will really support the growth and understanding of the Black community, and primarily Black youth. The TikTok portion is very interesting as well. They are very much so in favor of it. I think it's become a real mechanism that is being used in multiple ways, including educational purposes, not just for fun, which then makes that one of the more effective tools compared to some of the other social media platforms that also may be used. Um, I think last thing I will kind of point out is, as we are reflecting on where Black youth are right now, and as we get closer to the election, that enthusiasm, excitement is continuously growing. We just went to when we were in Philadelphia, we took a group of students to from Howard University up with us, and they were canvassing all over Philadelphia, connecting. So they're not afraid to go into other communities. They're not afraid to have conversations and go into spaces with other Black youth, just to spread the word, to get people ready and motivated for the election. And I think that everything that's in this poll is a reflection of that. I think I can stop there and pass it on forward.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, especially being on the road. For APIAVote, we're so excited to look into this survey, just because this year we've been very fortunate to be able to conduct once again our Asian American voter survey earlier this summer, and then more recently with our 2024 API survey that we conducted with API data. And then also even this year earlier, we've been able to conduct monthly webinars utilizing findings from the AP NORC survey, the Amplify, which is a Asian American Pacific Islander panel, to also dig in a little bit deeper on the API electorate. So for this particular survey, as noted, API youth voters show significant support for Kamala Harris over Donald Trump with a 30-point gap, which is a 63% supporting Harris compared to 33% for Trump. Now, this essentially mirrors the strong API backing for Biden in 2020 and demonstrates a continued preference for candidates who align with their key concerns. This continues to suggest that there's increasing political cohesion among API voters. Political candidates must understand that API youth voters are not only mobilized, but also critical in battleground states. For APIAVote, we are working with our local API ambassadors across various college campuses in helping students also make their plan to vote. With the API community being one of the fastest growing electorates in the US, especially in key battleground states, their votes have the potential to swing critical races in 2024. APIs as a whole exceed the margin of victory for all 7 battleground states in 2020, around which 1/4 were first-time voters during that election cycle. Around 60% of APIs turned out in 2020, and our survey indicates a similar level of enthusiasm this year. At APIAVote, we and our partners in over 29 states recognize the impact that our population could have in 2020, and that's why we sent 1.9 million translated direct mail to API households this year, following by calls and texts, digital ads, and hotline support this year. And we are increasing that footprint, in engaging all these, especially young voters. Now, in terms of top concerns, we're seeing that the economy at 78%, healthcare at 71%, and abortion 57% are the primary drivers that API voters are bringing them to the polls. And these voters are focused on improving their economic prospects, ensuring access to affordable healthcare, and safeguarding their reproductive rights. This is similar to the results over the summer from our Asian American voter survey, and candidates who focus on meaningful engagement with API communities, building their trust and addressing the actual issues that API voters care about will resonate with this influential electorate. With the economic concerns, API youth voters are feeling the pressure of worsening economic concerns, with 74% rating the national economy and 68% rating their personal economic situation as only fair or poor. This highlights the urgency of addressing economic inequality, inflation, and financial stability. API youth are clearly concerned on things like job security, housing, affordability, and reducing the cost of living. Now, there is a positive view on immigration. 61% of API youth voters believe that immigration helps the U.S. more than it hurts. They favor a balanced immigration approach, funding for border security, while providing a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. Candidates who really adopt an inclusive and balanced immigration policy are more likely to win the support of API voters. Harsh anti-immigration stances are likely to alienate a significant portion of this group, especially those with immigrant roots or family connections. And then lastly, I want to point out the widespread support for abortion rights. API youth voters overwhelmingly support legal abortion, with 72% believing it should be legal in all or most cases. This aligns with broader trends of youth voters prioritizing reproductive rights as a fundamental issue. Candidates, once again, who are committed to protecting abortion access will likely win over API youth voters. Conversely, restrictive policies on reproductive rights could result in losing support among this growing voter bloc. So with that, I want to go ahead and check in with everyone to see if there are any questions for any of the speakers, and if we could bring everyone back on. And once again, if you have any questions, we encourage you to go ahead and put it into the Q&A. Also would like to remind everyone that this deck and also any additional information, our report will be emailed to everyone who attended, as well as uploaded onto our websites as well. Don't see. Oh, Ronald, I think you raised your hand. If you want to go ahead and put your question into the chat. If not, any other closing comments from Guy or anyone else? Oh, here's the question. Can people talk about the indications in other surveys of a big gender gap among younger voters, with Trump doing better among men? Maybe Guy, since you're in the polling business, I don't know if there's something that you could provide any insights.
I can comment on that. I'm just pulling up our survey crosstabs to make sure I give a accurate response here. We see a gender gap in this data as other polls are showing, as Ron indicates. So, for example, young women of color in our survey are voting currently for Vice President Harris by a margin of 77 to 19%, so a difference of 58 points, whereas among young men of color, the margin is 40 points, so 18 points lower. Now, that's still obviously a pretty significant advantage for her of 40 points with the young men of color, but it is quite a bit, narrower than among women. So this poll would not tend to support the idea that there are some kind of really major, huge defections among young men of color going on in these battleground states, but it would certainly support the idea that she enjoys a particularly large advantage among young women of color.
If I can chime in as well, something that we did notice for the Latinx after VP Harris became the Democratic candidate was a surge in voter registration among Latina voters, in which we hadn't seen before. It was during that time, in the last 3 months before October 7th, which was the deadline for many of the states we do work, it almost tripled. So it definitely gained a lot of tractions with Harris, has gotten a lot of traction with Latina voters that we are seeing, and we don't have the points like Guy, but it's just an observation we've seen in the field.
Yeah, I know for APIAVote, we've also noticed that right after the DNC convention, a lot of the organizing in the Asian American Pacific Islander community was being conducted by the API women, who are really leading the efforts. So just in terms of some anecdotal observations.
And I think for us with the coalition, as we've been on the ground, what we're noticing is not really a difference between male and females when it comes to youth. It's more of an older Black male generational thing. And that is where we're working on developing additional messaging to get older generations invested and supporting, just participating in the electoral process completely.
The other question is, I may have missed this, but where did the issue of democracy land among youth voters in the survey? Also, was the issue of Gaza addressed in any of the questions or foreign policy more generally? And I think Rob Ping's going to bring up that one slide, Guy, if you want to respond. Oh, I think you have to unmute.
I apologize. Democracy and voting rights was not a sort of top tier voting issue when we ask young voters of color to pick the 3 issues that matter most to them. But we also asked separately just for each of these issues, is it going to be important to you? And 61% did say that democracy and voting rights was a very important issue for them personally in choosing candidates. So while it isn't as important as some of these other issues, it is definitely something that young voters of color do care about. We also asked about we also I was going to say, the other question was Israel-Gaza war. We did not have any additional questions going into their attitudes toward that, except that we did ask in the question about whether they had more confidence in Donald Trump or Kamala Harris to handle different issues. That was one of the issues included. And by a 24-point margin, 51 to 26, they said they would have more confidence in Kamala Harris to deal with the war in Gaza than they would have trust in Donald Trump.
Great. I don't see any other. Oh, here we go. One other question. This may be outside the scope of this particular survey. Can you speak to any changes in party affiliation over time for the API community? Asian Americans typically lean Democrat, but we've seen some growth in Republican voters in the community. To what extent is this a factor in swing states? Yes, so APIAVote, in generally from even starting in 2012, we've seen that Asian American voters, at least the top 6 Asian ethnic communities that we survey, are typically Democratic leaning, but there are variations among different ethnic communities. Typically, Indian Americans and Japanese Americans are the most Democratic leaning, and then Vietnamese Americans are more conservative and Republican leaning. But even this year in 2024, with our Asian American voter survey, including our API voter survey that came out in September, we saw a shift of Vietnamese voters leaning toward the Democrats and independents. And actually, the lowest number was for the Republicans and for Trump. So there are some variations that you see. I also placed in the chat apivote.org/research, where you could dig in a lot more closely at all the different surveys. And we will also be placing the people of color young voter survey information right shortly after this webinar as well. And with that, I don't see any other questions. But once again, would love to thank all of our speakers and everyone in attendance for today. Once again, we encourage you to go to each and every one of our organizations' websites to look further about what we're doing to mobilize young voters this cycle. And we look forward to having you utilize this information and really uplift the concerns and issues and the organizing that is really being done among people of color, young voters. So with that, thank you very much for attending, and we look forward to re-engaging once again.